So firstly, it's just so nice to see everybody, even albeit through the screen. It feels, I suppose, strange and normal, but it's still lovely to actually get a glimpse of you all. Of course, tomorrow night is going to be Rosh Chodesh Kislev, a month that we generally always look forward to with great anticipation because it's Hanukkah. And one of the fab things about Hanukkah, or at least this is what I realized one time I was thinking about how every Yom Tov kind of comes with a, I don't know, the pros and cons, right? You know, like Pesach's a lot of work if you're at home, but then there's the great parts of it. You know, Sukkot, if you're here, then you're stuck with the weather, but you know, everything's got its pros and cons. The great thing about Hanukkah is there's no there's no malacha issue. You can drive, you can be doing all your work, and you've got 8 nights. So you don't have to fight about which family members you see and which parties you go to. You've got 8 nights to get it right. And that's what I suppose, you know, please God, we won't be in lockdown by Hanukkah. And please God, even if we are, it's going to be Chani's Bat Mitzvah, the first night and the weekend of Hanukkah, which we look forward to, please God, celebrating with you all in some way. But either way, it will be a slightly different Hanukkah. And probably many of us are going into this month, not necessarily feeling the buzzy, excited, inspired feeling, or at least perhaps I'll just speak for myself, with the kind of ambiance and the losses that we've had the last few weeks. So what I wanted to really do was to, just like the title said, if the Hanukkah candles could tell their story, I wanted to speak this evening about 3 kind of backstories that we have behind the Hanukkah candles. What I mean by that is that so often we, the experiences that we have and the rituals that we do, they tell a story. And one thing that comes to mind, I remember years ago, I was giving a shiur somewhere. It was an inaugural event for something. And there was a Rebbetzen who came to it. And at the end of the shiur, she came over to me and she said to me, "One day I will tell you the story about how I came to be here today." I said, okay, you know, and I'm thinking, okay, big deal. So she got in her car and she drove from Essex and she came to the shiur. That's very nice. And then it turned out that there was a whole backstory that actually one of her children was getting engaged, but she had committed, she had told me she was going to come and she wanted to come to support the event. And so suddenly she had found herself torn between this, do I keep to my, you know, my word and my commitment and go to this event? And nobody knows about the engagement yet. Or do I suddenly let all the excitement that's going on in my life overtake me, which is really where I want to be, and not go? And therefore for her, she will always associate that shiur with that day in her life of her son's engagement and the triumph, I suppose, of her sticking to her word. And even though everything around her was sort of topsy-turvy for great reasons, she had still come and she had still stuck to her word. And that's something that nobody else will have that backstory when they think that back to that shiur, if they even remember it. And many of the experiences in our lives are like that. And I think it's the same for Hanukkah. We all have our own subjective personal experiences and our backstories that as we sit and we look at our Hanukkah candles burning, we think of many, many personal reflections, some of which are very warming, and sometimes it can be very nostalgic and very emotional and poignant. But there's also backstory that the candles tell themselves, a tale of Jewish history, a tale of Jewish resilience, a tale of Jewish philosophy. And that's what I want to speak about this evening. So what I would like to do is to look at 3 aspects of the candles, aspects that really are very technical, but how I believe behind the technicality of the way in which we light the candles, there's a story that's being told to us and a message. And hopefully these stories will be able to connect by the time we finish. Sound okay? Okay, thanks for the nod. Great, and lovely to see a few new faces coming on. Okay, the first thing is how we actually light the candles. Now, all of this is told to us in the Talmud, in the Tractate of Shabbat, which is where most of the details about Hanukkah come in. You know, Hanukkah, interestingly, seeing as today it's one of the most popular festivals, it doesn't have its own tractate. You know, you think there's one for Purim, Megillah, and there's one for, you know, most of the festivals they all have, but Hanukkah is just contained within the tractate of Shabbat, because when it's talking about Shabbat, what you can use to light your candles for Shabbat, it says, oh, and by the way, when you light your Hanukkah candles, so we'll give you a few rules about those. And then, by the way, when we're talking about Hanukkah candles, let's talk about why we actually light the Hanukkah candles. So it's the whole of Hanukkah, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself, not our topic tonight, is sort of wrapped in a by the by in the tractate of Shabbat. But the first thing is about how we light the candles. The Talmud says that the law is very simple. It's ner, ish, uveto. That every household, Hanukkah is all about the household. Every household should light one candle. Ner, ish, uveto. So if, doesn't matter how many people are in your house, every single night of Hanukkah, you light one candle. Okay, so by the end of Hanukkah, how many candles will I have lit? 8, thank you, Alicia, because every night I'm lighting one candle, right? But then, of course, you know, once you've got a level in something, out of everything, we've got to have a super kosher level and a super kosher level. And so the Gemara then says, but there's a better level. There's the Mahadran level. And that is, of course, that every member of the household lights a candle. So this suddenly, when you go past somebody's, let's say, for window for now, you would be able to see how many people are in the household based on how many of the candles they have. So if you have a household of 4, then on the 6th night of Hanukkah, you are going to have 4 candles in the window, just like you did on the first night and just like you did on the 8th night, because the number of candles doesn't change. It's just according to the number of the people in the household. Am I making sense? Right? So essentially, both of these are built on the premise that it's one candle a night. The only difference is how many people are in the household. So whether each individual comes and lights their own candles. Thank you, Corinne. Or whether it's just one per household. And then we get to the even greater level, which is the Mahadran, Min HaMahadran level, which is even disputed, because, you know, we never want rabbis to agree on things, because then it would just be boring, right, and uniform, and there'll be a lack of diversity. So this is where the dispute comes in, which is between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. That Beit Shammai say, well, on the first night, you should, both of them agree, I should say. The Mahadran and Mahadran is that the number of candles should change per night. And that is where the practice that we keep today starts to sound familiar, right? But the difference between their opinions is whether you descend in how many candles you light, you decrease per night, or whether you increase per night. So what do we do?
We increase.
We increase.
Exactly. We increase, right? So on the first night, therefore, you would light, let's say you're lighting per household, you'll light 1, and then by the last night, you'll have 8. That is the opinion, by the way, of Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai say it differently. On the first night, you should light 8 candles. The second night, 7, the third night, 6, etc., etc., etc. Until on the last night, how many are you lighting? 1. So my question is, it doesn't matter who we go by, of course we go like Hillel, that we increase. But the interesting question is what actually lies behind their debate? Why would you say increase and why would you say decrease?
There's a principle says Ma'alin b'kodesh v'lo moridin, right? Is it connected to that?
Very nice, exactly. This is the premise behind Beit Hillel, which is when it comes to matters of holiness, we always try to increase rather than to decrease. So that's why probably if somebody came and said, look, I'm going from keeping nothing in Judaism to keeping, you know, I really want to do more, you'd say, well, start with something and then increase it, and then increase it, and then increase it, rather than go for everything. And that can often be very difficult to maintain. So the idea is that we always try to increase when it comes to matters of holiness. And this is the opinion of Beit Hillel. And according to Beit Shammai, two opinions are given in the Gemara. The one is a kind of more obtuse reason, or seemingly obtuse, which is that the amount of offerings that were given on Sukkot decreased, and therefore the amount of Hanukkah lights, he takes the same kind of parallel and says, we'll base it on that. And the other way to look at it is actually a very simple thing, which is when you get to the first night of Hanukkah, and this is kind of psychologically so real, there's that feeling of, whoa, I've got all 8 days to go, you know, and I know how I'm going to spend my time. Should we try the chocolate donuts tonight? We can have the jam ones tomorrow. You know, there's a feeling of, I've got time on my side. I've got 8 days to kind of process this, to enjoy it, to, you know, diversify, to think about how I'm going to celebrate. That amount of time decreases. And therefore, you kind of are reflecting on how much time you have left rather than how much time you have to go. What do you think? Obviously, we know what we keep, but the question is, which do you think makes more sense? To decrease, either because we've got a precedent with that, with the offerings from Sukkot, and also because we know that we're getting less time. You know, we're going from 8 days to 7 days to 6 days, etc. Or because we say generically, it's always good to add in matters of holiness to increase. Which would you go with? If you were the ones deciding the law, would you say go with Beit Shammai to decrease or go with Beit Hillel to increase?
Increase, Hillel.
Because you're a conformist and you know that's the law, or because that just feels right?
Feels right.
It feels right.
Also, by increasing, you're increasing the lights. There's something quite symbolic about increasing each candle as well.
Yeah, it almost feels nicer, perhaps a different kind of perspective than decreasing the light. Yeah, very nice. So,
yeah, because you finish on a high rather than finishing on a low.
Yeah, yeah. I think.
I was going to say it's more positive. Building up and building up is more positive, whereas being big and going down and down is kind of more negative.
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, it kind of epitomizes, Hillel and Shammai were always disagreeing on things. And the truth is they just had very different worldviews. Shammai really stood. I said to somebody, who was I talking to the other week? And they said to me, you know, you should have named your other son Shammai, then you would have had the perfect balance in your family. You know, you would have had Hillel and anyway, but you know, Shammai stood for what was true. So for example, the very famous debate about, which I actually think is a really interesting, I don't know, I don't like the premise of the debate, but the question is, what happens with the bride? You'll be familiar, many of you, with the case study, with the bride who looks terrible. Can you still dance before her and say, what a beautiful bride? So Shammai says, if the bride is beautiful, you can dance before her and say beautiful bride. If she's not beautiful, then you can't, because that's lying. I.e., this is Shammai. It's like what's totally true. You know, on the first night of Hanukkah, you've got 8 nights ahead of you. You have to realize almost like how valuable that time is. Let's not sugarcoat. By the next night, you've already got one less night. Like, savor it. It's quite kind of sobering. I would agree. It feels a little bit more negative, but it's true. You know, whereas Hillel says about the bride, no, of course you always say to a bride that she's beautiful. Because if you start saying to some brides they're beautiful and to other brides that they're not beautiful, you're just going to cause upset. And anyway, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, which is why that kind of the whole premise of the debate is, you know, she's beautiful to somebody, hopefully to the one she's marrying. And therefore it's kind of a subjective thing. And then of course you say that she's beautiful. And so over here, this is kind of Hillel. He's got a different way of looking at the world. Let's start with one. Let's increase the light. Let's talk about increasing that when it comes to matters of holiness, we always increase. I want to also suggest that maybe they're not only just talking about the technicality of the Hanukkah candles, but actually this is to do with their philosophy, not only their personalities that I've just kind of alluded to, but actually their philosophies of what Hanukkah is all about, which is, of course, how do you deal with darkness? Hanukkah didn't come that it was just a wonderful time. It came after a hugely dark period for the Jewish people. And therefore, you know, the symbol of that little bit of light that lasted was a hugely powerful symbol as suddenly the light came into their lives. And what was the message they were actually trying to give? What do you do when you have a problem, when you have a darkness? There's something wrong in the world. What's the best way of dealing with that? And perhaps what Shammai is saying is the best way is to tackle it, right? You try and kind of tackle that problem. You shine a really bright light. You have to kind of use all your energy, all your efforts to deal with the problem. And then hopefully as that problem, you know, you're being effective in what you're doing, you'll be able to, you know, that the need for the light will be less. Whereas Hillel comes from a different place. You're not always going to be able to tackle every problem, but rather sometimes we can spend so much energy. You can shed all your light trying to deal with the issue, and actually you just end up being exhausted and having exhausted all your reservoirs. Rather, the best thing to do is you just go and be a light. Shine a light, look at the positives, start to do goodness. And that light will little by little increase. And then it will either by default have got rid of the issue, or it will have deflected the issue that suddenly it doesn't feel so big anymore. Ultimately, it was Hillel's way that won out, which is that sometimes we try and take on the world, and that's not always going to be successful. When we start small and we just say, let's do goodness, let's spread kindness, let's spread love, positivity, actually that can go a long way as it builds up. But ultimately, I think that whenever Shammai and Hillel are both recorded, it's because ultimately we really need the combination of both of them together. I want to really pause the discussion on them. This is the first story that our Hanukkah lights tell. And I do believe that apart from being kind of cynical that we never tend to agree on anything, that it is significant that there was this dispute around the candles, because the fact that both of them had a different worldview is because, and they were both recorded in the Talmud, is because they are both valid. And we need to be able to really think about both of them. And sometimes maybe there's a time to use Beit Shammai's approach, and sometimes there's a time to use Beit Hillel's approach. Now let's go back for a moment to this basic premise of how the Hanukkah candle started. We already today, because we increase every night, that's how we all, you know, that's our snapshot of Hanukkah, is, you know, you look at the candles in the window and you know if it's the first night, the second night, the third night. But the basic premise is ner ish uveto, that one candle per household. And it's really interesting that it's one of the main mitzvot that is all about the family unit. It's all about the household. And this is where we see our next backstory. And this is, of course, if we probably within our group, if we say, where do you put the Hanukkah? What would everybody say?
In the window.
By the window.
Except for Tali, because Tali would say that she's only been putting it in her window for the last year, but for the rest of her life, am I right? Or Tali, am I right? I'm guessing right.
Where are you taking this?
Where did you used to light the Hanukkah before you moved to London?
Well, by my parents' house, but also in my place in the recent years.
In the window?
Yeah, by the window. Why? Because in Israel you're supposed to do it not by the window, because Nes Gadol Haya.
So a lot of people in Israel do it actually outside their houses. Liat Petach Habayit, right? So sorry, I put you on the spot there. You're like, what does she want me to say? It was just an interesting.
My parents, my siblings, everyone, yeah. But you need to have this special thing. I wish I could do, but yeah, this is how they do it. Yes.
Okay. It's just an interesting cultural comparison, but actually, again, it tells a story of what's happened historically. So again, the Talmud says something very interesting. It says, this candle, where should it be? Where do we place it? So we understand the fact that we need to have one candle per household, or however we're going to do it. If we're doing mahadran, mina mahadran, as we just said, Beit Hillel, Beit Sham, but where should it go? And the answer is, it should go next to the entrance of the house, but in a specific place. Where's the mezuzah on the house? On the right-hand side, right? Yeah. So where do you put the Chanukiah? On the left-hand side, right? This is the suggestion. So suddenly, you've like enveloped yourself with these mitzvot. You've got the mezuzah on the one side and the Chanukiah on the other side.
That's how we light, actually. Shlomo and I light like that.
Right. But you put it outside your house or inside your house?
We put it in the doorway with the mezuzah on the one side and the Chanukiah on the other side.
Right. So then it goes on to say, but in times of persecution, if that's too difficult, then put it in your window. So what happened over time? That it became difficult. You know, it wasn't so easy for people to just have, even, I mean, can you imagine if suddenly in Belfast Park, we were all putting our Hanukkah up, you know, outside in the street? We would probably get some goodwill, but also it might not necessarily be appreciated by everybody to suddenly have, you know, candles all the way, you know, in a kind of multicultural area. And so therefore, not necessarily just because of persecution, but also just because of the recognition that Jewish people were living all over the world in different scenarios, said, okay, fine, put it by your window. But now many, many times, even putting a Chanukiah by the window would have been extremely dangerous. So then the Gemara says, in that case, just put it on your table. And the fact that you and your family will see it is enough. You don't need the rest of the world to see it. It's lovely if the rest of the world can see it, but even if it's just sitting there on your table, that's enough. It's interesting that when it comes to how many candles we light, you sort of see it going up. And then when it's about where you light, you have all your possibilities going down, right? In an ideal scenario, you light it outside your house by the so that it's on the other side from the mezuzah. If you can't do that, then light it in the window. If you can't do that, then just put it on your table. Interestingly, actually, you know, there's that lovely feeling of when you pass by a house and you see the Chanukiah in the window. And, you know, strangely, a few months ago, I got that feeling. It wasn't a Chanukiah, but it was seeing the NHS posters in people's windows. It gave me the same kind of feeling as when you see the Chanukiah lit, a certain kind of camaraderie, unity, a fraternity, you know, a feeling, oh, we've all got that same symbol. We all feel that same appreciation. And I thought, you know, it's strange. Why am I feeling like it's Hanukkah? You know, but it's interesting that it was the kind of same emotion. And, you know, one of my teachers, Rabbanit Henkin from Nishmat, she was speaking to her students before Rosh Hashanah. And she actually said, you know, you know, it's so difficult not being able, especially in Israel, they were on a more intense lockdown than we were. But even, you know, amongst us, shul wasn't like it normally is. Many of us were not even in shul. So she was saying, you know, it feels just so compromising and different. But let's go to the Hanukkah model, that actually we're bringing it inside. There's the ideal on Hanukkah where it's by your door. And then you go to your window. But actually, this year, she said, our Rosh Hashanah davening is going to just need to be on our table, just like the Chanukiah, that if that's what you need to do, it will suffice. And it took me back to seeing all those, you know, the rainbows in people's windows at the time that you really weren't seeing anybody in the deep, dark lockdown, and feeling that sense of connection, just like you do when you see somebody's Chanukiah in the window. But let's just come back for a moment to this idea of having it, like Linda was saying, that they make sure that they light the Chanukiah on the one side and have the mezuzah on the other side. Because I think that's a really interesting symbol, even though it's not what most of us do. And by the way, just before I do that, I should say, if we're talking about a kind of, historical trend, how we've gone through these different periods in time where it was originally people would light it outdoors, then people lit by the window if things were good. But when things were not good, it was just on their table inside. And actually, it's such a blessing that, we would, for most of us, of course, it can go in the window. But that's the blessing of living in our era, in the country that we live in, where our faith is accepted and celebrated. But also that if you go to Israel, as I was suddenly giving Tali the third degree about what her family does, is that they've actually gone back to this ancient tradition that's mentioned in the Talmud, where many, many people light outdoors. They light by the entrance of their homes, which is in many ways a beautiful expression of how we're suddenly fulfilling this age-old dream. We haven't done that for thousands of years since we were living in our own homeland. And now the fact that today, in Israel, that's probably the prevalent custom, is kind of coming full circle. And so just in looking at where people place their Chanukiot, how different it might be to what our grandparents did, it tells an incredible tale. So now we have this symbol of the mezuzah and the Chanukiah. What does the mezuzah remind us of? If we go back to the real origins of where we see that the Jewish people had to do something with the mezuzot of their homes. Pesach. As they're about to leave Egypt, the Jewish people have been totally and utterly passive. God's done all these wonders for them. And God says, go and paint the lintels of your house with the blood of the Korban Pesach. But interestingly, who was that a sign for? God didn't need, and we always learn, why did they need to do that? So that the angel of death would know which was the Jewish house and which was the not Jewish house. God knows who's the Jewish house. So why did they really need to paint the doorpost of their houses? Who was it for?
Themselves.
For themselves. They were essentially, for the first time, having to do something active. They were having to make a choice. And of course, in those times, the lamb was an Egyptian deity, and many of them were very assimilated. And they were steeped in the Egyptian culture. So this was the time that they were having to make a call. Do I want to be part of the Jewish people? Or do I actually want to be part of the Jewish people? I need to make that decision for myself. And therefore, where they painted the doorpost was actually on their own. It was inside the lintel. It was on the inside of the door frame. It was a very, very personal moment. It was a moment of recognizing their own identity. And that contrasts with the Chanukiah. The Chanukiah is integrally something for the household, but really the idea of it is that it should shine outside. And so suddenly when you have these two next to each other, I think it's setting a very, very powerful symbol about who we represent. That all year we have the idea of the mezuzah. The mezuzah is that going back to that moment in Egypt where we had to come to terms with our own identity. Really look ourselves in the mirror and say, this is who I am. This is what I believe. It's an incredibly personal moment. The Chanukiah reminds us, if you have that, then share it with the world. Shine it outside. If you can't shine it outside, then put it on your table. But it will still be the reminder that ultimately you want to share it with the world. And this is, I think the last couple of months, and I was just reflecting since we last met, although we did meet just before at the wonderful Women's Simchat Torah gathering, which was after this, but it's strange that in the last year, we've lost some of the greatest leaders of world Jewry of this century. And I was specifically reflecting on Rav Steinsaltz, who we had the memorial evening for a couple of months ago, and of course Rabbi Sachs, and both of them really embodied this and gave so much of their life's work to sharing the knowledge, sharing the identity, sharing the passion. When Rav Steinsaltz started his work on the Talmud, and I remember as a child when I started to learn Talmud, my teacher was very, very, started to talk to me about Rav Steinsaltz in very disparaging terms. He said, you know, Rav Steinsaltz, who, it's almost, I'm saying it here for his praise, which is why I feel like I can say it, but I'm almost embarrassed to say it. He said, you know, who does he think he is to be able to translate the Talmud? The greatest rabbis haven't translated the Talmud. And now comes along a man called Rav Steinsaltz, who we don't really know, and he's translating the Talmud, right? Which didn't sit well with me at the time, but I was kind of 9 or 10 and I just sort of nodded, you know, but really to say that, where what we've ended up with, you know, 25 years later, is we've now got an entire Talmud, which was only ever a few people were able to learn it. And now it's suddenly accessible, you know, in English, with vowels, with an easy to read commentary. That is an incredible gift. That even after his passing, he's essentially unlocked a certain treasure chest that is going to be accessible to the rest of the world forever. You know, that's the Chanukiah. He had his own sense of identity. He understood what his mezuzah was from a very young age. And then he said, okay, if I appreciate this treasure, now I need to make sure that I can shine the Chanukiah from the other side so other people are able to share the light. And of course, with Rabbi Sachs, you know, 2 things come to mind. The first was what Diane Binstock very beautifully said in his Hesped, which many of you will have seen, but it really struck a chord when he said that his daughter had reminded him that at his own inauguration, Rabbi Sachs had said, I don't want to be remembered as the author of many books, and I don't want to be remembered as the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth. I want to be remembered as the man who gave sweets to the children in shul. And Diane Binstock very beautifully kind of and artistically twisted that and said, you did end up being the one who gave us all sweets because you took some of the most difficult concepts in Judaism and you made them sweet, you made them palatable, you made them accessible. And I think you really see that, especially kind of going through the years of his various works. But it also reminded me that must be about, I think 12 years ago or so, Ellie and I were doing an internship, or I think it was when we were living in Israel, and we came to London for Rosh Hashanah, and there were a load of interns who were coming in to help for Rosh Hashanah, and so you get various meetings with, you know, different people in different places as a view to, you might come back to England at one point. So one of these things was a meeting with the chief rabbi of the time, which was Rabbi Sachs. And there was a question and answer session at Hamilton Terrace. And one of the rabbis, who's today probably one of the really most dynamic communal rabbis in London, put up his hand. And in those days, you know, everybody's on their life's journey. He had him and his wife had both discovered Judaism and had become Baalei Teshuvah, and they'd been learning in very intense yeshivot. And they wanted to come back and make a difference, but they were grappling with certain things. And one of the things that they were really sort of, that troubled them, and this was his question. He said, you know, I've got young children at home and I'm very worried about if I invite people in the community who are of differing levels of observance, or, you know, might have very different ideas in life, of that influencing my children, because, you know, I've made some painstaking choices in my life to kind of change my whole direction. And, you know, this is something we've kind of come to with such passion. I don't want my children to kind of be exposed to something that's more than that or different or whatever. Anyway, and of course, Rabbi Sachs gave the famous answer that he then wrote about many times after that, which was, you know, if you give somebody, if you split your money, then you're dividing your money. And if you know, look to split most things that you have in life, you will essentially be left with less. But when you look to share your knowledge, your wisdom, your ideas, your beliefs, your passions, you will actually always end up with more. And this, I think, is the symbol of light. And it's something that's also put very beautifully in the Talmud, which is that by default, when you light one candle, it will automatically benefit anybody who comes into its space. Ner le'echad, ner le'mea. You can't have kind of your sole monopoly on a candle unless you literally sit, you know, burying yourself in it. It will automatically be something that you know, impacts other people. And that was his message to this rabbi. And amazingly, kind of looking today, I think it's obviously something I've never discussed it with the rabbi since then, and I would actually like to. But I think it's probably something that they took that answer and found their way with it, you know, based on the amazing things that they are doing in the community today. So that's really the second backstory, is looking at where we light our candles, what the symbol of how we light our candles and how publicly we light our candles is trying to give us as a message for posterity, and also how over time we've had to light our candles or chosen to light our candles in different places. I want to add one extra element over here, and that is the whole concept of where lighting candles started. And of course, we model our Chanukiot is all modeled on the menorah in the temple, and because it's to remember the Hanukkah miracle, etc. But really, there's a very, very interesting passage when you look in the book of Bamidbar in the Torah, when they had the inauguration of the portable temple. Every single day, it was in a totally different month, by the way, it was in Nisan, and every single day there was a ceremony. A prince from one of the tribes came and brought an offering to the temple. Straight after this inauguration, Aaron the high priest is given the command that every day he should light the menorah. Okay? So this is now nothing to do with Hanukkah, at least for a moment it's nothing to do with Hanukkah, but we're now going back to the beginning of the temple era. Everything's exciting, everything's new. Every day one prince brings an offering to the temple, and then straight after that in the Torah, seemingly unconnected, Aaron's told, by the way, every day you should make sure you light the menorah. And as with every time there are two seemingly not connected passages next to each other, everybody asks, why are they together? And Rashi gives one opinion. He says, you know, Aaron saw how every day the princes would bring their offerings. And of course he was involved in this because he was the facilitator, but he also felt a little bit left out because he didn't have his own thing to bring. And so God said to him, well, you're going to get an even better job than everybody else because you will get to light twice a day the menorah. Okay, it's one position. The Ramban, living in 14th century Spain, quotes this Rashi. Alicia, this one's for you. And he says, okay, but it doesn't quite fit well with him because he says it just feels like a numbers game. It's basically like, well, you shouldn't feel bad because the quantity of what you're going to do is more than them because you're going to be doing something every day. And, you know, even though we can say that the best things in life, it's not about the big moments of being in a ceremony, but actually it's about the small things you do every day, there is still going to be a little bit of FOMO if you don't get a part in the big ceremony. And so the Ramban suggests something else. He says this was the first Hanukkah. This was the first, Hanukkah means inauguration. When a person has a new house, they make a Chanukhat Habayit, an inauguration of their home. This was the first inauguration of the first I was going to say the first temple, but it was the Mishkan, the first concept of a temple that we had. Actually, what God was comforting Aaron with was he was saying, you know, not everything happens overnight. There is going to be a Hanukkah in time. There will be another inauguration of the temple, which is going to happen after a lot of sweat and a lot of tears and a lot of blood. But that Hanukkah will have involved you, but that Hanukkah will involve your descendants. They will be the heroes of that Hanukkah. They solely will do the Hanukkah. They will re-inaugurate the temple. But that's not the greatest thing about that Hanukkah. The greatest thing about that Hanukkah is that after that, every single household for all time will light something that looks like the menorah every year in their house to remember the great miracle of the time. I.e., what God was saying to him was, there will be a time that there will be another inauguration, and that's going to be with your descendants who were the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim, who the Hanukkah miracle happens through. They're the ones who are going to come. They're going to rededicate the temple. So your turn's not now, but everyone has a time to shine. Your turn to come at an inauguration will be at that time when there's this re-inauguration of the second temple. But more significantly, and I think this really touches on something, the power of that will be that will be the inauguration that will really be remembered. We don't have anything in our ritual where we remember the first inauguration that happened. We read about it in the Torah, but this will be something that every household takes on. And the reason why I think this is such an epic position of the Ramban is because it actually recognizes the power of the household. And this is where we go back to that first part, Ner ish uveto, lighting one candle per household. And I think this pertains so much to the time period that we're in now. You know, when we don't have a shul and we don't have a central place, we don't have the temple, there's a feeling of such great lacking. You know, our kids are missing out so much. We feel that sense of disconnect. I've had people just over the past week who've, you know, even about their teenage kids have said, you know, if when their teenage kids are coming to shul, they're connected to something, they feel so engaged. And just that lack of shul, suddenly there's they might be engaged in many other ways, but there's sort of a feeling of a disconnect with the community, where they don't necessarily have the same kind of way on Zoom that we do manage to have as adults. But I actually, that's really what made me rethink about this Ramban, because what the Ramban is saying is that God was saying to Aaron, how much better to be a presence in a household. That has way more power than having a presence in a central place, because that's really what it's all about. And of course, this is where we come full circle, that over these last few months, we've had the challenge and the opportunity of looking at how we suddenly go back in, like that Hanukkah that we want to put by the entrance of the door or by the window, but has had to come into the table. That's essentially what's happened in many ways with our shul life. We had that nice honeymoon period, and hopefully it will come back very soon, the time that we'll all be back together again in the shul without any concerns. But for these months, that's really what we've grappled with. It's how can we bring shul? How can we bring community? How can we bring, that Judaism, the feeling that for so many of us is about connecting with our friends, our family, and even for the last few weeks, it could have been Kiddush in the garden. You know, suddenly it's this going back to putting the candles on the table. But actually, when we think of that Ramban, it reminds us that that's really where the greatest power lies. It's about going back to the feeling of having, what does the household stand for? It's one candle per household, Ner ish uveto. That's what Hanukkah is about, but that's also what its lasting message is about. It stands symbolically on the other side to the mezuzah. The mezuzah is that constant opportunity to reflect on our identity. What do we stand for? Then we look at how we share it with the world. But we're also reminded that Hanukkah, which is one of our only festivals, which is really about the household, shows us the power of sometimes going inside and being within ourselves, and remembering how even Aaron was comforted that his covered, his honor would be greater than those people who brought their offering into the temple, not just because it was about longevity and whose would last longer, but also because of the nature of the impact. That bringing it to the temple means that only those who come to the temple will see it. Whereas suddenly, when every household has taken something on, it means that it's something that almost grassroots is spreading into a national identity, that people want to imbibe, they want to take seriously, they want to think about, what does this really mean for me? And therefore, putting all of these together, especially with these times that we've been in and that we're going through, Hanukkah's never been just about the buzzy light. It was always about the light that came after a darkness, which is always when light shines the greatest way. When we look at the dispute between Shammai and Hillel and the way that we now follow Hillel, we're reminded that sometimes we can't take on the problems of the world And even though sometimes it's probably good to be a shammai and try and deal with the issue and shine the greatest light we can, but actually sometimes it's about starting with a small light. And when we start with a small light and it goes well, we can increase that and we can increase that. And suddenly we look around and there's been global change. We put that together with the same concept of the family, of how the Chanukah reminds us that once we found our identity, we never look to just keep that for ourselves. We always want to share that. And as much as we can, we want to share the love, we want to share the passion, want to share the sense of community and the sense of identity, which was one of the things that I'm always inspired and re-inspired coming together with this group, and especially the women of our community, the way that things are shared, ideas, passion, love. And thirdly, how even though it can be very, very trying, and I know that in some ways this second lockdown feels much easier perhaps than the first one, in terms of what's open, what's closed, work restrictions, and also the fact that for those people with kids, if your kids are not suddenly quarantining or whatever, you know, there is still school. At the same time, I think for many people it's actually much harder because it's just going on a lot longer. And therefore, even though at the beginning where, you know, Pesach time, we all rallied and said, yes, so it won't be a big Seder, but we're going to go within, we're going to put that Chanukah on the table, so to speak. We almost now need Chanukah to come along and remind us that even though it comes with hardship, actually the greatest power that we have sometimes is to go within our own household, even if that's just us by ourselves. And actually that's sometimes how we have the greatest impact on the world. And finally, looking sort of back at certainly the losses that we've had this year, and the great legacies that have been left to us by some of those that are no longer with us. Chanukah really tells us the story of faith, which I think is that they've really imbibed. And I can't go without, even though we always, of course, will leave politics out of it. But the world, of course, hasn't just changed because of coronavirus and the losses we've had within Jewry, but it's also politically, there have been many changes in the world. But I was reminded today of a wonderful vignette, which I think whatever our political views are, resonates. Which is that Joe Biden's grandmother said to him, it's not enough for you to just have faith. Now you need to go out and share it. And in a way, I suppose, that's really the message of Chanukah. So I'll leave somebody else to have the last word, but please God, looking forward, hopefully, this should be a month where we're blessed with health and with strength, and with a feeling of togetherness, even when we're physically apart, and that it will lead to us being able to celebrate Chanukah, at least in some way, together. Wishing everybody a wonderful month ahead.